You know, regardless of the overall quality of this episode, can we all just admit how goofy the visual of Sarak doing weird time-lapse martial arts is? Goddamn hilarious. Hello interwebs and welcome to my ongoing retro review series of Star Trek Discovery Season 1, being done in anticipation of Discovery's 5th and final season premiere later this year. Today we're going to be looking back at the 6th episode of Season 1, Lethe, or as I like to call it, when Jenny from the L Word entered Star Trek. Like, seriously, I remember when I first saw this episode, I could not get over Mia Kirshner playing Amanda of all people, like she is the mother of Spock. And what's even better is she nails it. So much so that she's still playing a part of Star Trek to this day, giving a brilliant return in Strange New Worlds Season 2 last year. Still though, at the time, it was so freaking hard to imagine this gal
was stolen from the lab.
What?
The negative was stolen. The negative was stolen from the lab.
Why do you keep on saying the word negative?
ending up being the emotionally thoughtful and wise Spock mommy. Speaking of parenthood, however, how's that for transitions for you? This episode is another brilliant continuation of Discovery's first season's look and nuanced critique of the underpinnings of fascistic thought. This time by looking at the nature of leadership, authority, and mentorship. And it does so with way more grace and subtlety than I remember from this episode. We start off the episode with two parallel scenes of mentorship. Burnham pushing Tilly on her path to captain, and Lorca running a military holo program with his protege, Ash Tyler. And these scenes clearly juxtapose their mentorship styles. Lorca clearly values Tyler's actions and militaristic mindset.
Don't apologize for excellence. I want my chief of security to shoot better than I do.
This speaks to Lorca's competitive survival of the fittest worldview that belies his authoritarian nature. Lorca is pushing Tyler to be more aggressive and warlike, not more thoughtful. Even commending him for thinking like a Klingon before offering him the job as Discovery's new security officer.
Figure I've seen you fly, shoot, fight like a Klingon. Need someone I can trust. Someone that understands war.
And considering we know that Ash Tyler turns out to be Voq at the end of the season, this must, somewhere down in the deep recesses of Ash Tyler's mind, confirm everything that he thought about the Federation. So, it seems natural at first blush that Discovery is setting up Burnham, with her encouraging and pushing Tilly to become a Starfleet captain, as the natural opposite. Yet there is something much more subtler happening here, as Burnham is pushing Tilly onto a prescribed path towards captain.
Everyone applying to the command training program will be smart. Personality doesn't count. Today, your goal is 6.5 seconds. Then, getting a transfer on a Constitution class like the Enterprise. After that, first officer track. See your path. Stay on it. Reach your destination. Cadet to captain. Just like that.
Follow this defined path and deny who you are in service of the greater good, i.e. serve the system's needs, and the system will reward you with authority in the hierarchy as captain. And this is the real mindset that the episode wants to break down. Before we get to that, though, some minor details here, because this scene also introduced two things. First, the fact that there are holodecks on Discovery, which got so many Trekkies up in a tizzy because holodecks are presented as a new technology on the Next Generation set 100 years later. It's against canon! Oh! And all I'm here saying is, Rec Room from the animated series, anybody?
What'll it be? A swim at the beach?
Also, who cares? I want to see a holodeck. Deal with it. But, more importantly, these scenes introduce the half-named Starship t-shirt workout wear to Star Trek. It honestly took me forever to figure out why they were wearing t-shirts that said disco on it, but when I figured it out, I was so excited. And the show just low-key gave us the cheapest and most comfy Star Trek cosplay option ever. Rito strong, y'all. This brings us to Sarak, who is injured and set adrift while en route to a secret Klingon diplomatic mission by a Vulcan logic extremist who clearly hates humans.
Humans are inferior. My sacrifice will be a rallying cry to those who value logic above all. Vulcans will soon recognize and withdraw from the failed experiment known as the Federation.
Not only is this terrorist a nice canon nod to the logic extremist faction of Star Trek Enterprise, but it also sets up the eugenic purity theme of this episode and this season's look at fascism. We've already seen this idea of racial purity come up in the Klingons earlier this season, but here we see that the supposedly utopian diverse Federation is also not free of this mindset either. But the episode takes pains to show that it's not just terrorists and extremists who echo this type of sentiment, but how it is actually ingrained in the biases of a culture in more subtle ways, as we see with the Vulcans of the Expeditionary Group also echoing the otherization of humans in Vulcan society, as it's willing to tokenize them, but not actually uplift them.
Expeditionary Group has examined Graduate Burnham's application with great interest.
Acceptance with honors is certain.
By conventional decision parameters, yes.
Your hesitation is to do with her nature?
Certainly her nurture is unquestionable.
This is such a fantastic look at how bigotry and racialized thoughts of purity don't just spring up out of nowhere in extremists, but root themselves into the various institutions of a society. The far right in America didn't come out of nowhere, but were building themselves off of the mindset that the institutions of America were founded upon. But even more smartly, this episode plays out these institutionalized biases in its effects on individuals and their emotions, specifically through Sarak and Burnham. Sarak, in what he thinks are his dying moments, reaches out to Burnham through their shared katra, causing Burnham to spring into action to save him. Upon release, I remember most of the conversation around this episode focused on the use of Sarak and Amanda as part of Burnham's backstory. While this detail was introduced in the series pilot, this was the first episode to really focus on Michael's connection to characters from Star Trek's past. And I remember many, myself included at the time, feeling that this was an unnecessary nostalgia pull. And while I still agree with that for the most part, especially here in Season 1, as I echoed in my review of the pilot that I did on this channel a few weeks ago, I'm shocked to discover how much better and more nuanced it works here. I don't think that this storyline would have worked as well if it didn't have Sarak within it, for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. That said, while I do still find the idea of a Katra connection across space being kind of goofy and a little bit strained, it actually ties not only into the themes of a connected mycelial network underpinning the universe of Discovery Spore Drive, as Stamets articulates.
I gotta say, this Katra stuff is way cool. An uncharted superhighway connecting all of consciousness and life?
But also the idea that consciousness and humanity is about connection to others, a core Star Trek value. Also, the CGI visuals throughout this episode are really cool and trippy. Get high on mushrooms and watch this, because it's a lot of fun. Not that I would know anything about that. But through this hippy-dippy Vulcan mind meld stuff, we see Burnham sees Sarak return to this moment in his past where Burnham thinks she was a failure to Sarak, a shame upon him.
I was rejected from the Expeditionary Group for being too human. My failure is his last thought. He doesn't believe in me, but I'm supposed to be the one who saves him.
She thinks Sarak's dying thoughts were of how she failed him by not being Vulcan enough, not being what the institutions of Vulcan wanted her to be, and thus lesser than. This is a really great depiction of how many marginalized people will ultimately come down with a form of imposter syndrome because much of their work is not valued by the institutions or systems around them, making them think that they aren't working hard enough when in actuality is the system that is keeping them down. And I would highly recommend this wonderful video by Mainly Mandy that goes into that in greater detail. This past familial trauma informs so much of Burnham's constant desire to be the best that we've seen throughout the season. This constant tendency that she has to deny her own sense of self and push down her own feelings and trauma in order to be what Starfleet or the Federation needs her to be, allowing her feelings and trauma to fester and erupt as it finally did at the Battle of the Binary Stars. Yet, we ultimately learn through this episode that in truth, it was Sarak who was the one who felt shame. That he was forced to choose between allowing Spock and Burnham into the Vulcan Expeditionary Group. Because the Vulcan group would only allow one token human in their ranks, especially if they acted more more Vulcan, but not two.
Spock is
half Vulcan. Another of your experiments. The integration of humans into our culture is an admirable goal, but it must be titrated. In honor of your position and reputation, I will accept one of your not-quite Vulcans.
And we see how this institutionalized bigotry that Sarak was forced to participate in caused Sarak to feel a sense of shame that had been instilled in him through his sense of Vulcan pride, with him made to feel that if he felt any emotion about having to choose between his two children, he was somehow less of a Vulcan, because he was feeling emotions.
Do you ask me to make an impossible choice?
Your reaction to this is quite illogical, and suggests a conclusion based on emotion.
And then how he passed that shame onto Burnham as shame in herself because he was not vulnerable with her, by closing himself off and making her think that it was her fault that she did not get into the Vulcan Expeditionary Group. echoing how often masculinity is used in a very similar way in our society today. Don't feel any emotions because to feel emotions would make you less of a man, thus closing off many fathers from being open with their children.
Instead, you made me believe I failed you. You manipulated me. Do you have any idea what living with that lie did to me?
I did not. But I do now.
All of this is so thoughtful given the entire season's overall themes of fascism, because putting it in that context, this episode is showing us how fascism finds its roots in cultures that wield shame, masculinity, trauma, and conditional acceptance based on forcing you to act as part of the dominant culture. The fact that this story is centered around Michael Burnham, a black woman, is incredibly thoughtful, as America often tries to argue that black people would be better if they just acted more white to fit in, with the implication being the racist notion that being black is somehow less civilized. It also speaks to how societies built on hierarchies often push minorities into competition with each other. Spock and Burnham ultimately have to fight each other for a place on the Vulcan Expeditionary Group, despite their obvious skill warranting them a place on it. But also these institutions not understanding that people may want to do something different, such as Spock choosing to join Starfleet instead of joining the Expeditionary Group.
He's not yet begun his studies at the Science Academy.
Upon completion, he will apply to the Vulcan Expeditionary Group, and then there will be not one, but two.
This is exactly the same mindset that we see in something like girl boss feminism, where women are often seen as having to be against each other rather than uplifting each other to help women overall. All of this shows that fascism does not spring out of nowhere, but is a system built on hierarchical oppression and exploitation through racialization and class differences, ultimately violently attempting to reassert itself. But those hierarchies have to exist in the first place within a system and be made invisible and made to seem natural for fascistic thought to be able to build itself off of said systems, once those systems start to falter under the weight of their lies of purity and superiority, or an extreme moment of crisis, as we are currently seeing with the ongoing Klingon War. All of this will eventually lead to what we see later on in the season of the Federation falling more into a fascistic line of thought as the Klingon War progresses. All of the underpinnings for those things are still implicit within the structure of what the Federation is, and this episode is laying the groundwork for that through the usage of Vulcan civilization, which was a founding member of the Federation itself. We are reminded of that fact, by the way, by seeing a Vulcan admiral speaking to Lorca, showcasing how Vulcans are an embedded part of the system, and thereby their bigotries also probably helped inform the foundational ideas of the Federation itself, just as racial connotations were part of the founding document of America itself. And by the way, I should say I'm talking a lot about America specifically because Star Trek as a franchise is an American-centered show, even though it does go out to most of the world. And it is also very clear to me, though maybe I'm biased in my worldview, that Star Trek Discovery is very much centered upon speaking to America, especially in its first season. Though I think a lot of these issues can be applied more ubiquitously across the entirety of the world because many of these same issues are not exclusive to America, though may present in specific ways given America's specific racialized history. This episode ends, though, with a really great scene with Burnham confronting Sarak about his shame. And I love that this situation is not clearly resolved, as Sarak is still full of shame and not ready to be emotionally vulnerable, and instead still denies his familial connection with Burnham in order to protect himself, which Burnham challenges him on.
Help me understand what you did. It could make us grow closer, not further apart. That's what families do.
Technically, we are not related.
You can do better. But I won't push you.
Yet this scene does enable to have Burnham move forward in her character arc, finally able to recognize that she has denied her humanity in the pursuit of denying her emotions through Vulcan logic. She eventually finds by allowing herself to feel her emotions, she's actually more complex and more human than she thought.
The conflict inside me has been between logic and emotion. Now it's my emotions that are fighting. I feel angry, but I want to love. And I'm hurt, but there's hope. What is this?
It's just being human.
I also love the fact that the line about having conflicting emotions makes you more human comes from Ash Tyler, who we eventually learn is really Voq, a Klingon himself who had bought into the racial purity mantra of T'Kuvma. This subtly sets up Tyler/Voq's arc of himself overcoming this fascistic thought through his growing connection to others like Burnham throughout the season. We also see Burnham tell Tilly to follow her own path to captain rather than following a path to captaincy that the Federation system tries to tell her is the only way to get there.
I gave you bad advice. There are a million ways to get to the captain's chair. Find your own.
This, by the way, really beautifully comes back around in Star Trek Discovery Season 4, where we see that Tilly ultimately chooses not to pursue becoming a captain, but instead a teacher at Starfleet Academy. It showcases that by pursuing herself and coming to understand who she really is, Tilly ultimately learns that being a captain, this thing that she was told was the ultimate goal for everyone to attain, is not actually what she wanted for herself. The seeds of a brilliant arc for Tilly are placed right here, despite the fact that so many of us, myself included, thought that Tilly's whole arc was about her becoming captain, when in reality it was about her finding her own path that didn't include becoming a captain. All of this goes to the theme of mentorship, how mentors should not press those they are giving guidance to be just like them, lest it become abusive or fascistic, but to help those that they are guiding to be their true selves. It's this same mindset that's being used against transgender children right now. How many anti-transgender parents will want their trans kid to be normal rather than helping them be their true selves, leading to abuse of said child. All of this showcases how these first few episodes of Star Trek Discovery are so good at articulating really nuanced Star Trek themes, something that Star Trek often doesn't do with its more operatic feel. I'm not hating on that. I love Star Trek being very operatic and over the top with its messages sometimes, but here, Discovery is going for something much, much subtler. The Federation and Starfleet should be about enabling you to be the best version of yourself that you can be. It's why there's the mantra, infinite diversity in infinite combinations. And that's also the whole of Star Trek's ethos. These institutions should not be about giving yourself to the system of Starfleet or the Federation. It is not the Federation, the institution itself, that should be exalted, as that leads to ubiquitization and conformity, the very fear that Takuma himself expressed. What should be exalted is its ideals of inclusion. That is what Star Trek is about, exalting the ideas and values, not the systems themselves. Because the systems are always going to be flawed in some way. That is what Star Trek is about. That we always must strive to be more than we are, even if we may not ultimately reach that goal. It's ironic, given that this mentality of venerating the Federation, Starfleet, and Star Trek itself through canon is something that I hated seeing in more modern Star Treks like Strange New Worlds Season 2 or Picard Season 3, as I spoke about in these videos. And it's also the same mindset that guides supposed Trekkie purists to hate any deviation from Star Trek canon like holodecks appearing in Discovery. It's because they venerate the institution of Star Trek as a franchise, not the ideals of what it's about. Which Discovery, for all the criticisms thrown at it that it doesn't get Star Trek, clearly understands at a deep, deep level. All of that said, there's still another story in this episode that we haven't talked about, with Lorca meeting with Admiral Cornwell, who comes to try to reach out to him after seeing that he has been a changed man through his supposed trauma during the Klingon War. Like Burnham, though, Lorca is clearly unable to actually be vulnerable with Cornwell, instead reacting based on trauma, fear, and viewing those around him, like his crew, as competition to beat down or dominate or control. Cornwell clearly calls him out on this, but he avoids opening up to her by distracting her.
Less than a week ago, you were being tortured. Now you're back in the chair. How do you feel about that?
Are we in session? I didn't know you were practicing again. Because if I have your undivided attention for 50 minutes, I can think of a whole bunch of other things we could be doing.
But Lorca's true self comes out when he holds a phaser to her head as a trauma response when she touches him while they're both asleep, leading her to point out that she can't trust Lorca anymore because she doesn't know if he's being manipulative or not.
I lied about everything and I need help.
I hate that I can't tell if this is really you.
All of this works so well as a way to showcase how fascism exacerbates trauma and asks us to deny our humanity, our emotions, and our connections to each other. And I love that this message works in the context of Lorca being a war veteran suffering from the trauma of his ship, the Baran's destruction, as well as the context that we learn later on that Lorca is from the Mirror Universe, an entire universe where fascism leads the way, and Mirror Universe Lorca, himself a fascist, would never allow himself to be vulnerable because he's never been in a universe where vulnerability was something safe to express. That said, I do remember that the twist of him being from the Mirror Universe eventually removes the excellent nuance of Lorca's character to make him simply a mustache-twirling fascist, which is incredibly sad because Isaacs, especially in this episode, plays Lorca's fear and vulnerability so well.
I'm grateful to serve under a captain like you.
I'll talk about this more in future reviews, but I really wish that Lorca's encounter with the Federation and people like Burnham and Cornwell, who show that they actually care about him and his emotional well-being, had an effect on him down the line. On the theme of leadership, though, Cornwell also calls out Lorca's authoritarian style.
You're pushing this crew. You're putting the ship in harm's way. You've been ignoring orders.
I'm in front line, Kat. You gotta make decisions in a second, sometimes less.
Which is why Starfleet needs you at your best. I'm not sure we're getting it.
Lorca eventually appears to curb this impulse, seemingly due to his moment of self-reflection that was caused by Cornwell.
In the past, we have engaged in alternative thinking on these matters.
What if we go after her and it's another trap, Mr. Saru? Did you consider that? Starfleet can't afford to lose the Discovery. She's bigger than all of us. If so ordered, we will try and rescue the Admiral, but not without authorization.
But in actuality, this is just him not being willing to save Cornwell, as she was going to take his captaincy of Discovery, and thereby his access to the Spore Drive and his ability to get back to the Mirror Universe. That said, I do like the subtle hint that Lorca sets Cornwell up to be captured by the Klingons at the end of this episode in order to protect his position as captain of the Discovery, as well as the mirror imagery of the episode's final shot, hinting not only at Lorca's ultimate Mirror Universe reveal, but also the trauma that underpins his entire worldview, that causes him to constantly see the universe as something needed to be fought against. A lot of shit is given to the visual style of Star Trek Discovery and modern Star Trek, but when it hits on a cinematic level that we rarely got to see in Star Treks of decades past, which is more focused on being theatrical rather than cinematic, which is not necessarily a judgment, just a difference in style. All in all, this is one of my favorite episodes of Discovery so far, because it highlights how institutions make invisible their bigotries, and how that not only leads to fascistic thought, but also continues to create trauma in individuals who are told that they are not enough for a system that will never value them in the first place for who they are, thus leading them to denial of their emotions and selfhood that again perpetuates fascism. The episode also slowly hints that the only way through that is to radically pursue yourself and realize, as Captain Archer once said, that the most profound discoveries are not always beyond that next star, that they're within us, woven into threads that bind us together. That vulnerability and connection to true selfhood is the only way to defeat bigotry and truly reach that Star Trekian future. That's my thoughts on this episode of Star Trek Discovery, but what did you all think? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, and beyond all of that, my friends, live long and prosper.